All right, today we're going to jump into something pretty old, a text from 1679, but it asks a question that feels incredibly current. What does it actually mean to fear God? We're going to crack open John Bunyan's classic work on the subject, and I think you'll be surprised by just how much it has to say to us right now.
So let's just start there. When you hear that phrase, fear God, what's the first thing that pops into your head? For a lot of us, probably most of us, it's not a positive image, right? It's terror, judgment, maybe some cosmic scorekeeper just waiting for us to mess up. In our everyday language, fear is pretty much always a negative. It's something we're supposed to get over, to conquer.
But for the guy who wrote this, John Bunyan, you probably know him from the Pilgrim's Progress. That modern idea of fear just wasn't it. He basically argued that we've got it all wrong. He said the right kind of fear wasn't a punishment, it was a gift. It wasn't the end of joy, but the very beginning of a wise and full life. So let's see if we can rediscover what he was talking about.
Okay, so first up, what is the fear of God? We've got to start with Bunyan's big foundational idea here.
And notice this right away. Bunyan doesn't say fear is the final destination. It's the beginning. It's the starting line. It's not some dead-end street called terror. It's a fountain of life, the source where all the good, wise stuff comes from. And that one little shift in thinking, it's the key to his entire argument.
And this is really important. This fear isn't just another thing to check off your spiritual to-do list. Bunyan uses this brilliant analogy. He says it's like salt. You don't sit down and eat a bowl of salt, right? But it makes everything else taste better. He's saying that any prayer, any good deed you do without this kind of reverence is just bland to God. It's the one ingredient that gives everything else its meaning.
So just as we're starting to get comfortable with this idea, Bunyan hits the brakes and gives us a huge warning. He says, hold on, there's another kind of fear out there, a counterfeit, and it's not just unhelpful, it's incredibly dangerous.
Which brings us to what he calls the wrong kind of fear, or ungodly fear. And this isn't just a weaker version of the good stuff, it's the exact destructive opposite of that life-giving fountain he was just talking about.
So how do you know if you're dealing with this fake fear? Well, Bunyan says it's actually pretty simple. Just look at what it does to you. Does it make you want to run for the hills and hide from God? If the answer is yes, then that's the wrong stuff. This is the kind of fear that just creates more distance, more separation, and in the end, just leaves you in despair.
And he gets really specific about it. He gives us 4 big red flags. First, it makes you resentful. You start to see God as this harsh boss you can never please. Second, it makes you hide, just like Adam did in the garden. Third, it can totally paralyze you, like that servant in the parable who was so scared he just buried his money instead of doing anything with it. And finally, it makes you try to save yourself through your own efforts, because you just can't bring yourself to trust in God's mercy.
Okay, so that's the toxic stuff. What about the good stuff? What does the right kind of fear, this godly fear that Bunyan is championing, actually look and feel like?
He calls it God's treasure. Just think about that word for a second. Treasure. Not a weapon, not a threat, but a jewel, something precious and rare that God gives as a gift to the people he calls his own children. It's a sign that you're in the family, not that you're about to be condemned.
And this slide, right here, this is basically the whole argument in a nutshell. Ungodly fear is the cowering dread of a slave in front of a cruel tyrant. Godly fear is the deep respect and reverence a child has for a loving father. See the difference? One pushes you away, the other draws you in. One is all about terror and punishment, but the other, and this is the absolute core of it, is rooted in understanding that you are loved and forgiven.
So that brings up the big question, right? How do you get from one to the other? How do you stop being the terrified slave and start being the reverent child? What does that journey actually look like?
Well, Bunyan lays out this 3-step transformation. It starts with what he calls an awakening. Now, this is a healthy fear of judgment when you first truly see your own failings, but it's not where you're supposed to stay. That fear is meant to push you to step 2, adoption. This is where you experience God's forgiveness and have this mind-blowing realization that you're not a slave anymore, you're a child. And that leads to the final, lasting state, filial fear. It's a fancy term, but it just means the kind of fear a son or daughter has. You're no longer afraid of being punished. You're just driven by a deep, loving desire not to disappoint the Father who has given you everything.
This quote just nails that shift in relationship. It's about moving from a distant, formal God to someone incredibly close. That word Abba is Aramaic, and it's super personal. It's much closer to daddy than it is to father. It signifies this complete change in how you see God.
and it all springs from this new, godly kind of fear.
So let's say you've made this journey. You've gone from being a slave to being a child. Now what? What does this filial fear actually do for you day in and day out?
And Bunyan is really clear about this. This is not just some nice, warm, passive feeling you get. Not at all. He says it's an active, powerful force. It's like an engine in your soul that starts to produce real, actual changes in how you think and how you live.
And here's the payoff. Here's what that engine produces. It becomes the beginning of real wisdom. It makes you genuinely hate evil, not because you're scared of getting in trouble, but because you know it offends the one you love. It makes you more watchful over your own thoughts and actions. It deepens your reverence for God, and ultimately, it becomes that fountain of life, helping you steer clear of all the destructive traps, the snares of death, that ungodly fear would have pushed you straight into.
Let's land on this powerful paradox that Bunyan builds his whole case on. Just listen to it carefully. It doesn't say we fear God so that we can get forgiveness. It says forgiveness is already there with God, and that's the reason we fear Him. The awe, the respect, the desire not to let Him down, it all flows from the mind-blowing reality of grace, not from the terror of judgment. It flips the whole thing on its head.
So, that's John Bunyan's radical idea about fear. And it leaves us with a pretty big challenge, doesn't it? For us, today, in a culture that mostly sees fear as something toxic to be eliminated, how does this 350-year-old idea, this concept of a fear that's actually born from love instead of terror, change the way we think about our own lives and what truly motivates us?